Hey, all, welcome to the Common Good Podcast. Super glad to have you with us today. It's Wednesday, January 24th. Liz, I've had my mind in February. I've been inside of a spreadsheet typing in dates in February and March. So pardon me for
At
living
least
in
you're
the.
ahead and not behind.
That's right. At least I didn't say it was 2023, like I
Right.
did for a couple of days. But this is the Common Good Podcast, and it's a Wednesday. You probably know that if you keep track of your February or your January 24th. And on Wednesdays, we like to talk about faith. And so excited to talk with Liz today. Liz Cooledge Jenkins, writer and author of a book called, just the greatest little title, Nice Churchy Patriarchy, reclaiming
That's right.
women's humanity from evangelicalism. So a fun little title and then a hit you in the gut kind of subtitle. So excellent. So Liz, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
Hey, and now you live in Seattle. I live in
That's right.
Minneapolis, and two towns that people think they have a lot in common. And sometimes we have weather in common, actually. And so we start our podcast very often by chatting with people about how the weather is where they are, because we can't always agree on things, but we do remember that we live under the same sky. So Minneapolis currently 32, cloud covered, drizzly, freezing rain, going to be 36 degrees today. How are things looking there? And
Well, that
Seattle?
sounds all sorts of delightful. It's a little bit warmer here. I think it's probably in the 40s or going to be. And it's been pretty nice the last couple days, but we had a ton of rain before that. So that was a little bit more typical. And before that, we had a huge freeze, which was not at all typical. So, yeah.
Did you have one of those big cold snaps like the rest of the country where people screaming at the sky and begging for it to warm up?
Exactly. Yeah, it got into the teens, which is very unusual for us. It's usually pretty mild. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I'm glad to have you on today, and thanks for reaching out and letting me know about your book. And a special thanks to Bing, who's already here in the chat. I did message him to know. Sometimes people wonder, how do you get on the Common Good podcast? For people, it's a bit of a life goal. No, it's not. Well, most often you just send a note and say, "Hey, I'm doing something interesting," or we stumble onto what people are up to. And so I'm so glad that you reached out. Before we talk about your book in more full detail, Nice Churchy Patriarchy, talk about what you do and what got you into, well, first of all, writing. Why are you a writer, and why are you a writer about what's going on in churches and all that? So give us your background.
Yeah, so my background involves working in college ministry for kind of a conservative evangelical church in the Bay Area. And at some point, when I had been doing that for a little bit and was enjoying it, I realized that I had really no education or training for it whatsoever.
Huh.
So I applied for seminary. And I ended up doing an MDiv degree and kind of not feeling like college ministry was maybe where I wanted or needed to be long term. But then having all of these things that I learned in seminary that I found totally mind blowing and wanted to share. Please excuse my cat if you're watching.
We accept animals on the podcast. Yeah.
Okay, this is Athena.
Nothing
And-
says YouTube like a cat walking into a video, so it's perfect for those on our YouTube channel.
Perfect. All right. And so I think the most of the time while I was in seminary, I kind of assumed that I would probably apply for PhD programs after because I was just loving everything that I was learning and wanted to continue. But by the time I graduated, I think I started to feel a little bit more like I wanted to go in a direction of writing things for kind of a broader general audience. Because sometimes you get into this academic theology world and it can be a little bit hard to break out of kind of writing things that can only be interesting or accessible to this very small subset of people. So when I graduated, I really wanted to see what I could write that would be meaningful to people more broadly. And I found myself unpacking and trying to understand a ton of experiences I'd had as a young woman in church, and wanting to do that with others. So that's kind of how this writing thing and how the book came about.
Did you get into college ministry because college ministry was meaningful to you at a point in your life? Like, did you sort of transition from being a college student and having a positive experience to then thinking, hey, I want to be one of the leaders that does that kind of work?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I generally had a positive experience in a parachurch college ministry as a student. And I think there was a time a couple years after I graduated when I kind of did a lot of soul searching about what do I actually want to be doing with my
Mhm.
life and
Sure.
career. And I feel like a lot of the things that I was really passionate about lined up with ministry of some sort. And college ministry was what I was familiar with and felt like something to try.
Uh, One of my favorite conversation points with authors is to ask them if they had run into their book at some previous point in their life, how they would have responded to it. Because I've wondered that about books that
Mm.
I've written, and some of them I'm like, oh, I would have loved it because that's a book I was wanting to read, when I was 20 years
Yeah.
past. And other times I've thought, I don't know, I think if I saw that title or that topic of a book that I wrote, I'd been like, what's that guy talking about? Like there would have been a point in my life where I would have thought, I don't even know what they're up to. So when you were in college ministry, or I don't know, maybe a college student, or even involved in a church, as a teenager and so on, if you had seen a book with the title "Nice Churchy Patriarchy," how would that how would that have landed for you? Did you know those words? Did you wonder about those ideas at the time? Like how would that have landed for you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think as a teen or college student, I would have been like, "What?" Like, I mean, I grew up in a church that had female pastors and female elders, and nobody really felt the need to debate about that.
Yeah.
So I don't think that I would have had really a grasp of like, "Oh, like there's still churches that don't have those things."
Right. Right.
Yeah, but I think as a young adult, like into my 20s, I might have seen this book and thought, "Yeah, yeah, I think I need to read that." And so I think it's been a bit of a journey to kind of resonate with some of those words and to understand this idea of patriarchy and unpack that. And yeah,
Yeah. I mean, the word patriarch is an interesting one when you're in the church kind of world, because sometimes the characters in the text, the Jewish text that becomes a Christian text, are referred to as the patriarchs in kind of a positive way, right? like,
right,
like
right.
it wasn't talked about as a negative
Mhm,
force.
mhm,
Um, and that surprised me, when once I realized that patriarchy was a thing that was still functioning inside of our society and inside of our communities of faith. Like, why did we always talk about that as if it was just sort of an old thing and kind of a positive thing? What's been your own trajectory with patriarchy? And part of the reason I ask is because I know a lot of people who, when that word comes up, they're like, I don't even know what you're talking about. like they, they understand, like, if places where women can't do things, like get
mm.
elected president, or can't serve at a church or something. They know that, but this whole category, as if that's a thing that some people know and some people don't know. Talk a bit about that word, and did you wonder about using it in the title and in the book and so on?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we got the patriarchs in the Hebrew scriptures. We've got the early church fathers that we might often talk about in kind of the early times of Christian history. And yeah, I mean, I think there are also matriarchs in the sense
Hmm.
of women in the Bible and church mothers in terms of women
Sure,
in church
sure.
history, whose stories have often been downplayed or ignored and need to be reclaimed. But yeah, the word patriarchy. I mean, you mentioned countries where women can't be elected president, and one wonders. I mean, can a woman be elected president in the
Hmm.
U.S.? It hasn't
Hmm.
happened yet, even though the rules technically allow it. And you have, Christian denominations where women are not prohibited from being pastors, and yet less than 50%, whether it's 20% or 2% of pastors are women. So there's a lot going on
Yeah,
there
yeah.
often that serves as barriers to women using their gifts and leading in different ways that they might feel called to. Um, and I think patriarchy as a general concept has to do with how power is distributed and whether
Hmm.
that's even across genders. And so I think there are a lot of different forms that takes, whether or not there are female leaders, there can
Yeah.
still be ways that we have a lot of internalized kind of biases and
Hmm.
sexism and how all that plays out. So, I mean, there's other similar words like sexism, which is kind of about discrimination, or
Yeah.
like misogyny, which is about hatred of women. And I think I like the word I mean, I use all of those and I think they're all very real, but I like the word patriarchy for the title because I think it helps get at those power structures and how we might better share power together across genders.
One of the write-ups describing the book, I'm going to read it because I think it's really provocative and says it well. It says, even in the warmest and most welcoming evangelical churches, patriarchy looms as the ever-present force, suppressing women's possibilities and debilitating whole communities. Well-intentioned churchgoers and church leaders have bought deeply entrenched male-dominated mindsets, power structures, and theologies that are not working for women and really are not working for anyone. There are some people who they don't know that that's what's been going on. Were you similar to that? Like you could see things but couldn't really figure out quite what it was, because there's also in many of these communities such warmth and such, kinds of inclusion and such other things that people really love about these communities. And when somebody really loves something, it's hard to be honest sometimes about the struggles in it. Is that an experience you had, and do you see that in others when they've come across your book?
Oh, totally. Yeah. And I think that I reflect in the book on how I feel like I've been some combination of lucky and wise, but mostly lucky to
Mm-hmm.
avoid kind of the worst
Mm-hmm.
sorts of patriarchal church communities, because there are some highly publicized ones and some
Yeah.
very clearly, to most people, egregious ones. But I mean, the churches I've been a part of have been, like you've said, warm, welcoming, good communities in a lot of ways, communities where I met a lot of wonderful people and where people often operate with good intentions. And
Mm.
so that can make it really hard to see, let alone point out the ways that patriarchy operates there and that it's not okay. So I think it was really a journey for me over many years to move from kind of feeling like, well, the church has these policies that I don't love. Sometimes people say these things that I don't love, but we can
Yeah.
kind of agree to disagree. And it took me a bit of a journey to learn to take those things seriously. And then after that, to learn to speak
Mm.
up about them.
Oh, tell me about that journey. How did that go? Do you remember the first time when you were like, "Oh, I'm gonna say something"? Is that a moment? Is that a season of time that you recognize? Okay, it's time for me to speak up about the things I've awakened to.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just happened very slowly. I think there were a lot of times and a lot of moments, even that I talk about in the book, where people kind of said things or things happened that really only many years later, after reflecting on it,
Mm-hmm.
was I able to articulate like why that wasn't okay, maybe what was going on there, and what I might have said if I could go back to my 20 something self. So I think that learning to speak up about it has come after many years of reflection. Yeah,
When you
it's
first said something about it, did it go over well? Was it well received? And you were like, "All right, hey, this is a thing that I like talking about, and people want me to talk about." Did it
yeah,
happen differently than that?
I think it's well received through writing in the sense that
Oh, okay.
women and others who resonate with these things are like, yeah, we need to be talking about it. Like,
Mm-hmm.
a lot of women can relate, I think, to a lot of the stories I tell. And I think it's always just helpful to see things through someone else's eyes and be affirmed that we're not the only one
Yeah.
who's seen some issues and having some difficulties. Because I think a lot of times when women do try to bring things up, they're often told, either directly or indirectly, like, you're the only one who thinks that. Like, this is
Yeah.
kind of a problem with you as opposed to with
Mm-hmm.
this system or our
It is.
policies. Yeah. So I think it's well received in writing. I think in the moment, I think it's hard. I think it takes a very mature person to kind of receive feedback in the moment, and I think that's a hard thing to sort out.
The subtitle, "Reclaiming Women's Humanity from Evangelicalism," is uh, a broad statement and a good one and an accurate one. And there are some evangelical traditions where women are highly encouraged into ministry.
Hmm.
Some of the charismatic Pentecostal traditions have a long history of being founded by women
Hmm.
and women preachers, and
Yeah.
other parts of even what's considered the broad, I don't know, ecosystem of evangelicalism, like the Southern Baptist and fundamentalist Baptists, uh, and other fundamentalist sects. Women are forbidden, from any level of leadership
Right.
over men, or sometimes from even speaking at places. And then there's lots of versions of all that. Um,
Yeah.
how do you help people kind of navigate thinking about that? Because a lot of us tend to take our own experience and normalize it and just assume that, if you identify in the category of evangelical, then what you experienced is what evangelicals do.
Sure.
Um, can you just talk a bit about all that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been helpful for me that I feel like I've experienced a bit of the variety of and a bit of the kind of spectrum of what evangelical communities can be. Definitely not the full spectrum. There's lots of communities that are a little bit more foreign to me, but
Hmm.
I write in the book both about the pretty conservative kind of, well, they call themselves soft complementarian evangelical church that I was a part of for 11 years. And then I also write a bit about the egalitarian evangelical seminary that I attended
Hmm.
and the church that I went to while I was in seminary. So those are both spaces where women are welcomed into ministry, and yet things are not necessarily equal. There's still a lot of work to do to
Yeah.
reach full gender equality, whether that's in terms of how women's voices and perspectives are heard and believed or not, or
Hmm.
whether that's in terms of how many female professors you might have if you go to an egalitarian evangelical seminary. And I write a bit about some of the kind of casual comments that some of my well-intentioned egalitarian male professors would say that made seminary a difficult place for me as a woman,
Hmm.
even though they never would have intended that. So I think there's a
Does
lot.
something
Yeah.
come to mind when you're remembering back to that you're comfortable sharing? Like, what kinds of things would you hear as a fellow seminarian that would make you think, wow?
Yeah, yeah. Well, one of the stories I tell in the book is about a professor who was telling us a story about his parents' church that they had pastored when he was growing up. And he was telling us this kind of conversion story of this man in their community who was kind of a well known, like, I don't remember exactly if he was kind of a drug dealer, just kind of a well known, like, unsavory
Hmm.
individual. But he went to my professor's parents' church and converted to evangelicalism and got super into it. And the story was about how his life was totally changed and he was no longer doing all these bad things that he had been doing. And everybody saw that and it was amazing. And then the professor made this comment like, well, he never really quite figured out how to treat women. But, other than that, his life was
Uh,
totally changed. And everyone kinda laughed at that, right? And it was thrown in
yeah.
there for humor, but I was kind of like, "Oh, like, what message are we
Wow.
supposed to take away from that about how it matters how men treat women?" And all of the male seminary students in that class, like, what message are they supposed to take away? And,
Wow.
yeah, what
That's
kind of
so
value that we
insightful.
have.
Yeah, right. Because if
Mm.
he'd said, well, he never quite figured out how to make money other than selling drugs, but other than
Right.
that,
Right.
that wouldn't have counted as the part of the full conversion. But if you still treat
Right.
women in a dangerous and unequal way, well, that's okay.
Right. It's, like, not a big
That's something you
deal.
can work on. Yeah.
Mhm,
Wow. Wow.
mhm.
See, even
It's
when
not
you
as
told that,
comfortable.
I don't know that I would have picked that up right away either if I'd heard that story. I would have thought, oh yeah, that's something that people work on, and that's horrible.
Yeah, so things like that
Yeah.
happen all the time, and it's not intentional, and yeah, but it's worth thinking about for sure.
Hmm. Um, this book you told me in email got a lot of attention and it's doing well in the area of the way Amazon divides up the categories, which is just hilarious. I have a friend that was like the number one poet in some subclass of a subclass of a subclass, but he has a screenshot of which he's the number one selling poet in
It's very
you know
specific, yeah.
in three to 11. But your book did well in the area of was it women's spirituality or women's?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, which also is interesting, right? That even Amazon's going to be like, let's make a difference between women's spirituality and non-women's spirituality.
Right, and
But
if you
anyway,
look at some of the bestsellers, there's, like, some C.S. Lewis, some Tim Keller,
yeah.
like, they're often not even written by women or specifically for women, but yeah.
And how do they know that it's for women? I don't know. Maybe
Yeah,
Amazon just knows a lot more about who's clicking and buying and downloading and so on, uh,
maybe,
and
maybe.
they can categorize that. What do you think it is that when people see the title, because you can't judge a book, you're not supposed to judge a book by its cover. But it's
What you
pretty much
do.
what we do with books. Yeah, it's why
Right.
there's covers and cover designs. So like, we'll put yours up there now. Yeah, I mean, it's you probably spent a lot of time thinking about the cover and the title and all that
Mhm.
because we really do judge books by its cover. Do you have a sense of why people are coming toward this idea, and what do you think that says now, not only about churches but about sort of the larger cultural world and maybe even political world that we're in?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're still in kind of a larger cultural moment where a lot of people are leaving evangelicalism or rethinking their relationship with evangelicalism, as well as just kind of thinking about what does that word even mean and do I resonate with it? So I think this idea of kind of reclaiming things from evangelicalism, like reclaiming parts of ourselves that we feel like maybe our relationship with evangelicalism didn't affirm, I think that's really powerful. And then I think with a nice churchy patriarchy title, I think, we've seen a lot of documentaries come out about kind of
Uh,
abusive, more openly abusive churches. And I think that, like, the nice side of it, I think, can sometimes go like, fly a little bit under the radar.
yeah.
So, yeah, I think that, hopefully people resonate with that sense of, like, how do we tease out the things that aren't okay, even in these communities where nothing really, like, salaciously bad is happening, like, nothing really, like, illegal is happening, but there's still, like, these power structures that need to be changed. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
I was talking with a pastor, yeah, just yesterday, in fact, and he's on staff at a church. And I said, "Hey, how are things going?" He said, "Oh, the last 3 years have been really, really tough. One of the former senior pastor left, a new person came in as executive. It was terrible,
Mm.
really bad." He said, "Very abusive to the staff and really controlling in a very bad environment." And the church fired him, and then hired another person, and he said, and now that person went to work at, and he named this other church. And I said, "Oh, did you ever say anything to the other church about it?" He goes, "Well,
Mhm.
actually, I said something to some of the people at that church that this person was abusive to a lot of us on the
Wow.
staff, and we fired him." And then the senior pastor from the church that person went to called me and said, "You have to stop being a gossip."
Oh, no.
And so this guy was like, I don't know what, I don't know. And I was like, "Hey, just good for you. Like, we have too many no talk rules and too many,
Mhm. Mhm.
competing forces." Th-
Mhm.
Do you have any thoughts on why churches, especially, I don't know, I'll just say churches, why churches tolerate so much bad behavior and abusive behavior from leaders and then allow them to get passed on so they don't so they're not called a gossip or something? Like, I don't know,
Right?
like on the range of things, and maybe I shouldn't make a range, but uh, I think when you're telling the truth about why someone was fired and you think someone is dangerous to the spiritual and emotional health of other people, you should probably say something about that, not be
Right.
worried if you're called a gossip. Do you have any thoughts about why that just continues to go on and on and on, that abusive behavior is just considered acceptable?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree, like, we've gotta talk about these things, and there's a lot of forces trying to get us not to talk honestly about
Yeah.
these things, and I think sometimes, I mean, I guess I felt like in my more evangelical days, sometimes I needed to, like, represent the church well because
Yeah.
that means representing Christianity well, and if we want to convert people to Christianity, we
Wow.
need to, like,
Hmm.
give a good impression of what it's like. So, I think I've really kind of done a 180 on that, and I
Hmm.
feel like rather than being called to bear witness in the sense of, like, how awesome our churches are so that others will join them, I think we're called to bear witness in terms of speaking honestly of what we know and what
Hmm.
we've seen, the good parts and the bad parts, and not worry about kind of the reputation of a church or community, because that is much less important than the reality of it, right? We want to make the reality one that is good, not pretend that everything's okay
Yeah.
if it's not. Yeah.
Mm. In that description that I read earlier about what's in the book, saying that, look, a lot of people have bought into these patriarchal ideas, including women. Do you feel like you have a particular voice, or there needs to be some particular messaging to women who hold patriarchal views? Because I've experienced that too. I mean, some of the most fierce sort of people arguing for male leadership in churches that I've been involved in conversations have come from women. that are in those churches, in those communities, and so there kind of becomes a thing that feel where it's easy to think, hey, women are going to be opposed to this kind of stuff and men are going to be for it. And it's not always that way. And do you think there's any special messaging for women versus special messaging for men or for young people who identify as male or female in those particular categories?
Yeah, that's a good question. I agree with you that it's often it's often women who defend these systems. I do think that probably the majority of women do not defend these systems,
Yeah.
but there are some vocal ones and some powerful ones who do. And I mean, I respect different women's rights to have their own opinions. At the same time, um, sometimes the women who these patriarchal systems, like, it feels like it's working for them. I think
Mm-hmm.
sometimes maybe it's helpful for them to know that it's not working for others, and to kind of hopefully develop some empathy and compassion for the women who it's not working for, because there are a lot of us. And
Mm-hmm.
it's really not
Mm-hmm.
working for anyone, right? But it can seem to be
Yeah.
working for women who kind of fit a particular mold or have particular interests or gifts or have no interest in
Yeah.
pastoral leadership or anything like that. Women who don't kind of rub patriarchal systems the wrong way. And that, yeah, I think it's good to recognize that there are many of us who do rub patriarchal systems the wrong way, and how do we make room for all sorts of women and all sorts of different women's gifts?
The person who goes on YouTube by the handle The Squirrely Prepper Lifestyle, also knows Penny, wrote, as a woman who was raised in the church, Bible reading disturbed me as a young girl, defined the authority of a male-dominated religion. Um,
Mm,
that is clearly there. And also, I think there's a way to read, especially the New Testament, in terms of, oh, this is really trying to change the narrative around women, kick
um,
into some different topics around all that and how the church hasn't always advocated for that. In the work that you've been doing and when people engage your book, where does the scripture text fit in for you in how you've arranged this? Because I know a lot of people have just had to say, I just have to be done with the Bible because I can't see it in any way that's not just heaps of trouble. And
mm,
other people find a very freeing narrative there and a changed narrative.
mhm.
How do you find yourself with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Personally, I grew up in a church that was not kind of a conservative evangelical church, and I grew up reading the Bible. And so I think for me, my first experiences of reading the Bible were good, right? I don't know if I want to say liberating, because I don't
Mm-hmm.
know if I had any consciousness of what I needed to be liberated from or for. But it was the way that I got to know God and a God of love. And those were the first things that I saw. So I think I've had a little bit of a different journey with the Bible than people who have grown up in very conservative spaces where they're
Mm-hmm.
always saying the Bible says women can't do this or this. So I think because I wandered into those spaces as a young adult, it's been a different kind of journey, and more one of like, okay, like, what do these passages really say? Because I don't think that they're trying to say these things that people are saying that they
Mm-hmm.
say.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, in the book I get into a little bit of some of those passages. It's not meant to be like a thorough biblical exegesis, but I do get into some of the ones that I think women often
Mm-hmm.
hear, and are impacted by. And I think in some cases there's a lot of nuance to those texts and how we read them. And in some cases you just kind of have to weigh things together and take the whole of scripture together, in terms of like, yeah, Paul says these limiting things in one chapter, but the next chapter he's like, yeah, women are speaking in our meetings. So you have to kind of, yeah,
Yeah.
weigh that.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Right. I mean, there's just so much in there, right, about how we engage with the text of the Bible and
yeah,
which passages we pick and which ones we like to emphasize
right,
and why. And I mean, so the Bible is a complex interpretive act.
yeah,
Anytime somebody reads it, whether it's taking views you and I might hold about these issues, or people who hold the other side of the views about these issues. Evangelicals represent a significant number of people in the United States. We're talking, 70 million, 80 million, something like that. It's a lot out of
Yeah.
330 million, and have a disproportionate amount of influence in government, partially because of where they're clustered and the way we divide up our governments, especially at the federal level, where every state
Mm,
gets 2 senators. So you have no matter how many people live there, so it's not
right.
proportional. And then similarly now with Congress, it's not proportional to the number of people per se. It has a cap to it. So you can have a situation where you have political leaders and political influence that's slanted, giving more power to certain groups if they choose to organize and engage. And
Mm.
evangelicals have chosen to organize and engage in the last
Oh,
50
yes.
years in some pretty powerful ways, and have ended up setting the direction of the country on a lot of issues that are rather disturbing to many of us. So when someone pivots into what I'm going to do right now, into a conversation about the cultural and political spaces and the influence of evangelicalism, and particularly a patriarchal view and a strongman view of patriarchy, which you can say something about if you want, or I'll tell you more about what I'm getting at here. Um, that's why, because there's something going on. And it's mind blowing to a lot of people why someone like Donald Trump would be attractive just to 50 or 60, 70% of evangelicals, self identified evangelicals in this country. They can't figure it out. They say things like, he's nothing like them, but they're missing something important. And so, anyway, I won't tell you what I think they're missing when they say things like that, but what do you, how do you attribute any of this, or do you think about the attribution of any of these ideas that you write about in Nice Churchy Patriarchy to the larger cultural and political system?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I write a little bit in the book about kind of my personal experience of the 2016 election, and I was still attending the evangelical conservative church I was a part of at that time.
Mm-hmm.
And I, up until that election, I had a lot of naivety about where people at my church were at politically. I think I assumed that there was a lot more agreement. Yeah. And
Mm-hmm.
so when the 2016 election happened,
Mm-hmm.
um, I was pretty shocked to see how many white evangelicals in general voted for Trump, and then to realize that there were people in my church community who voted for him. So I think I definitely went on that journey of like, wait, how did we get here? How was I so wrong about what people thought? What am I missing? Like you said, because I definitely feel like, this person does not represent anything that Christianity means to me. So, yeah, I think that one of the things that's been helpful for me that I would offer is just the book Jesus and John Wayne
Mm-hmm.
by Kristen Dumais, which is just this really detailed and fascinating historical account of the last 100 years or so in terms of what evangelicalism is and has become and how that relates to politics. And she really does a deep dive into like how evangelicalism has tied itself so closely to patriarchy, to a particular image of manhood and what manliness means or looks like, and how all these things are really toxic and yet have kind of come
Mm-hmm.
together in a particular person, that people were attracted to vote for because it's in a long line of kind of things like that, even though many of us like me didn't see it. Yeah.
There's a real movement inside of some versions of evangelicalism that say that the problem is that churches have become too soft. They've become too uh, uh, not just in with the culture, but kind of too, you know, uh, non-masculine. I mean, I hardly want to even say the words that people say about this stuff, but they say it all the time. You hear it
Mhm.
quite often. And that, in Kristen Dumais' book, Jesus and John Wayne, she borrows that title from a song, which is basically about Jesus is a little bit like Jesus, which is like his mom, and also a little bit like John Wayne, which is tough and mean and strong and all this kind of stuff. And so there's this real wondering, in evangelical churches from, I don't know, yesterday we had a conversation with someone who wrote about contemporary Christian music in the 70s and 80s and 90s.
Mm.
And she mentioned Carmen. And, I remember seeing this video. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it was a music video called The Champion from this person named Carmen, who's a musician. And it was Jesus in a boxing ring. And so that kind of imagery of Jesus in a boxing ring, boxing against the devil or whatever.
Mm.
This kind of idea of a warrior and wanting there to be a warrior. I hear evangelicals say about Donald Trump, like, hey, we've been pushed around too long, in this world, and it's time for us to fight back a little bit. Or Lauren Boebert, the congresswoman from Colorado, saying, had Jesus had an AR-15, he wouldn't have been crucified. Like this kind of stuff, right? That's just like, what now? I think peace and nonviolence is the strong way forward. So I have a whole different orientation that actually comes from the life and teachings of Jesus. Do you? I'm going to do a cart before the horse, chicken and egg thing for you. Like, what part of it do you think is like people want churches to be strong, so they kind of lean into patriarchy, and what part of it do you think is they just think the order of things was like God, men, women, and so men have a testosterone problem, and so therefore let's bless it and baptize it as an okay thing? Do you have thoughts on any of that?
Oh, yeah.
Or maybe you think about it totally differently, and feel free to say, like, I don't even have those categories.
Oh, man. Yeah, I mean, the God, men, women thing, that's, I feel like, something that has been promoted very aggressively by a very small set of people and then adopted by a huge mass of people who I feel like have been manipulated to think about things a certain way that isn't particularly scriptural or faithful to what I think Christianity is or could be. Yeah, and I think all of this has to do with even just how we think about and define masculinity and femininity. And I think I was kind of teaching a class at my church recently where we got to think through these things together, and we kind of made a list of all the different characteristics or things that are kind of culturally associated with masculinity, and then did the same for femininity. And I think it was really helpful to just see that written out, whether that's like for masculinity, like violence or dominance or control, or like positive things like leadership, that still shouldn't be particularly gendered, but are not negative. So I think seeing all that and recognizing that like this is not a healthy way for a human to be, right? This is not a healthy way for a man or woman or person of any gender to be. And same with femininity. So I think it was helpful to recognize that we have aspects of both of those things, or at least the positive parts of them within each of us, and to kind of tease out like, like what is this kind of cultural thing and how is that harming everybody? And like you said, what does it look like to actually be strong for people of all genders? Because the way of nonviolence, like you said, is not an easy one. Right. But I think it's the way that we're called to if we're following Jesus. Yeah.
My wife is a yoga instructor and instructor of yoga instructors, so she runs a yoga teacher training program. So they do a lot of really deep yogic training and philosophy. And it's curious to see the development of yoga following similar patterns to situations in the United States. Like a lot of us think about yoga in the American context as an activity that women participate in. But traditionally, yoga has been a male-dominated situation, and all the yogis were men, and they were actually very patriarchal in a lot of yogic systems. And one of the features also inside of yoga is the conversation about energy, like you were talking about, and male energy and female energy. And it's talked about in how we embody all of these, and we should access all of these. And sometimes the yogic world has gotten it really wrong, and sometimes it tips, I don't know, it becomes sort of one thing or the other. And that's the binaries that get us into trouble a lot, because human beings just talk about male-female stuff, energies or leaderships or abilities or capacity or whatever. And it gets off kilter a lot. And some people end up now looking at how people talk about gender. And so even when my wife is talking about this stuff in teaching, she's mentioned to me that like some of the non-binary people in her training program are like, I'm not even comfortable talking about male-female energy like this, right? Like they don't, that's not a thing they want to do. All right, so that's a lot. But how, are you thinking about any of that in our current situation now, where it's not just egalitarian? The movement for a lot of people is to try to become post gender in some way, or see if we can get outside the boundaries that language seems to produce for us when it comes to gender and the rest.
Yeah, I mean, I think non-binary and other queer or gender fluid or just people with different complexities in their gender identity have a lot to teach all of us about all of this. And yeah, it's so complex. And I feel like we're just kind of
Mm-hmm.
starting as a culture
Mm.
to acknowledge some of that. So I'm always trying to see what I can learn from queer folks, and how people challenge my sense of what gender is or what it could be.
Mm-hmm.
Another thing, this is going back a little bit, but, I was kind of thinking about what you said earlier about churches being criticized for being too soft, and I think that's a deeply misogynistic
Mm-hmm.
criticism, because, yeah, we associate things like softness with femininity, and then we devalue femininity and devalue
Right.
women, but there are qualities like softness and gentleness, and kind of peacemaking and kind of community oriented thinking. There are qualities that have been associated with women and kind of devalued, but like we all really need. Like we're really suffering as a society for not having this orientation toward harmony and gentleness in the ways that we interact with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So that's just another thought from earlier.
Yeah, right
Um,
on. There was a study that I heard about, or heard someone who did the study. Sometimes it gets a little confused, or maybe I made it up. So it could be any combination of these. But it was, um, I think, neural pattern testing or blood level tests of people in meetings when there were only men in the room, and then a mixed genders, and then only women, and what
mhm,
happens to people's bodies, even when in the mixed gender thing, if women were in the group, even if they didn't say anything, just the presence changed blood levels and testosterone levels and neural patterns and so on. And so
Interesting.
it was a big thing about why leadership and boardrooms and this is business kind of stuff was
Mm,
saying, look, you when men are in a group just with men, testosterone levels go up, and when testosterone
mm,
levels are rising, people make decisions that tend to have a certain characteristic to them: more risk
um,
taking, more binary. When testosterone levels are down or estrogen levels are up, different kinds of decisions are made, and having women just in the room changes the thing, right? Like there's something kind of going on, and I feel like churches or communities of faith or whatever have intuited that stuff for a long time, and that's partly why we don't have women in leadership levels, or we don't have women in this role. Like, we've built a spirituality around a certain set of capacities and decision making styles
mm.
and ways. um, so this patriarchy, I don't know, I guess what I'm thinking about is maybe there's something biological going on that we sort of get addicted to, not just what are we comfortable with, in sort of a social psychological way. So I know
Yeah.
that might all be new information to you, and you might not yet have an opinion about it. But any thoughts you have?
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely interesting. I feel like there are a lot of studies that show that mixed gender groups of people just make better decisions. And
Mm-hmm,
there's probably a lot of reasons for why that happens,
mm-hmm,
including, I mean, I feel like the perspective I take in the book is more along the lines of homogenous groups of people never make the best decisions. Like, you need different perspectives and different viewpoints. And not just in terms of gender, but also in terms of
yeah,
race and economic class and all the different experiences that people have. So, yeah, I think Christianity has a long history and also present day reality of groups of very similar men thinking that they're the ones who get to make all the decisions,
mm-hmm,
and that
mm-hmm.
has not served us well. That's kind of gotten us into a lot of the messes that we're in, and we need different kinds of leadership to help get us out.
I've been in spaces, this in the last 10 years, where I've been like, I think maybe even posted something on social media that was like, let's just let women be in charge of everything for a while and see,
Well,
see how that goes, right? Like,
right.
all right, let's. And then, in politics, I see there's a string of governors in charge. There's a string of Congress people that are women. And I'm like, okay, no, 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 no. We're not doing that. We're not doing the gun toting and the pseudo
Right.
violence. Like it's not enough.
Yeah.
So I've felt myself in kind of a, like, we've had a bunch of men running stuff and it's a nightmare. So let's let women run it and that's going to be better. And I see Wakanda movies and stuff and think like, um, do, any advice for people like me that think stuff like that? Like, is that the answer? Is that what you think
Mm.
where we could go? Like, what do we do about all this?
Yeah, I think that's a good question because you're right. It's not just about the gender of who is in power. It's also about the ways that power is used and whether it's used, well, for the common good, right? Or for other purposes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think about like matriarchal societies, and I do think that like kind of traditionally matriarchal societies are often um, like power often operates differently there, not necessarily just because you've got a woman in charge. But what you often see is that power is more shared, that power is used more for the common good, that there's more of a sense of community orientedness and mutuality. So I do think that there are alternatives to a patriarchal society where things work really differently. But I think you're right that it takes more than just women in a couple places of power.
Mm-hmm.
And it matters, like where women come from too, right? And if they've been raised in very patriarchal systems and if they've been raised to believe things like violence is the answer and dominance is the answer, and dominance for our one subgroup of
Mm-hmm.
people is the
Mm-hmm.
answer, then we might perpetuate those things. And so I think
Yeah.
we need kind of a whole like different way of teaching people how to be
Mm-hmm.
in the world. Yeah.
Is that something that the book helps people with? If this is the conversation that they're in or they want to be in,
I hope
is the
so.
book
Yeah.
is the book is the book structured in that
Hmm.
way? Like, hey, here's a pathway forward, or is it structured as here's a way to see and understand, and now we need to find our ways
Hmm.
forward?
It's both. I'd say the first half is more focused on understanding some of the issues, understanding some of the ways patriarchy works in faith communities in particular, and why that's a problem. And then the second half is more focused on where might we go from here if we're trying to build faith communities where things work differently. So
Yeah.
it's not necessarily like how do we fix the US, but all of it's interconnected, right? And how do we build different kinds of church communities where people are being formed to think about things differently? I think that impacts
Mm.
voting and everything.
What are the suggestions for churches on how they can proceed differently?
Yeah, and there are a lot of different things that it gets into. Some of it is kind of understanding church history in a different way and understanding that there's been this long 2,000-year push and pull between kind of different views on how power should work and what women should or shouldn't be doing in leadership. It's not like the feminist movement is a new thing of the last few generations. There's always been women who are leading in different capacities and using their gifts or fighting to do so. So I think understanding history and some of those stories is really powerful just for women to know like we're not alone, we're not
Mhm.
trailblazing.
Mhm.
There's this long kind of all these foremothers that we can look back to for inspiration. So there's that. There's thinking about scripture in different ways. There's kind of paying attention to who is in the pulpit and how they're reading scripture. And are we seeing the women in scripture? Are we seeing women in scripture as fully human, as
Mhm.
subjects and not just
Mhm.
objects? And then there's kind of all the ways that we talk about and imagine God in church. And is that coming across as masculine, even if we might not say, I think God is an old white man in the sky? All of our language and songs might kind of point in that direction. So, how do we expand the ways that we talk about God? So, those are some of the things involved.
If someone's super new to this, or someone has a friend or family member and they want to get into this kind of conversation, how do you suggest people do it? Like, if they haven't sort of started with a set of conclusions, of where we sort of are in this conversation, um, but I don't know, they're closer to where you were 15 years ago, or some of the people in churches that you've known.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice of, hey, this is super helpful, and I suggest not doing not doing this and such, or does the book have, or do you personally have any sort of help for people? Because, I guess like ordering this book and just having it sent to your mother-in-law might not be the best, like, hey, I got something coming from Amazon for you. I just want you to take a look at, nice Churchy Patriarchy, a little book we could talk about.
Right.
I mean, I guess it has to do with family dynamics, but do you have any suggestions about how people engage with this if they're new to
Yeah,
it?
I mean, I do think it can help to just have a book to talk about, right? Like, that can be a little bit less threatening than, like, "I
Mhm.
think these things." It can be like, "This person thinks these things, let's talk
Oh,
about it."
yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I would say for me, a lot of my journey has been just making a really intentional effort to read female writers, female faith writers. So I mean, if somebody's not ready for nice churchy patriarchy, or if that might be off-putting to them, maybe some of the work of Rachel Held Evans, on kind of, what church is and could be, like Searching for Sunday or Faith
Mhm.
Unraveled, or some of Sarah Bessey's work, Out of Sorts. And yeah, I think just a lot of women faith writers who are rethinking things in some really
Mhm.
powerful ways,
Mhm.
that aren't necessarily like directly like smash the patriarchy, but might kind of help us just open our minds a bit and think about things differently. So, yeah.
Yeah, and put you in a peg hole here, but some of those authors, and uh, perspective is, I had to be done with being an evangelical in order to be free from all this.
Mm,
And when you read their writings, you feel it, and that's the deal. And there's some people who they just have too much investor. They just love it too much. They don't
mm.
want to move on. They can be
Yeah.
talked into why living in a condo is a better idea, but they just love their house and their neighbors and they're not moving, and so
Mhm.
metaphorically, they're not moving. Um, Sometimes the books that deal with these issues are written by people who are out or on their way out, or that's pretty much what people want. And look, most of my friends are out, and they're still my friends. So I have no judgment about if you're in or out. Just know it
Mhm.
lands really differently for people who don't want to be out.
Mhm.
Um, so here's the not putting you in a peg. When people read this book, are they going to hear Liz saying, "And I'm finding a way to stay in," or do they hear no opinion about that, or on the way out, or what? How will people? How do people read you? Do you think in your relationship to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that for me, I felt like I had to leave church contexts that weren't serving me well, but I still identify with Christianity, and I go to a church currently that's a
Mm-hmm.
more progressive community, and that just resonates more with where I'm
Mm-hmm.
at and what I believe. And that's been a really healing and powerful thing and a really good thing. So I think that people will probably hear that, right? That has been my experience, and I'm very happy with it.
Uh huh. Uh huh.
But at the same time, I hope that people also hear a lot of kind of openness and respect to the different ways that women might feel called, or the different choices that women might make. So I hope that there's kind of this like twin invitation to, like, if you really feel like you want to stay, like, think about ways to maybe speak up about things and maybe push for change, or even just ways in your own personal spiritual life to
Mm-hmm.
embrace a different
Mm-hmm.
side of God, and embrace some different ways of thinking about things that might feel liberating for you, even if you stay in this community that doesn't quite buy into that. So I hope there's kind of that alongside, like, if you need to leave, leave, right?
Yeah.
Like, if a
Right.
faith community isn't good for you, it's okay to leave. You don't owe anyone your staying, right? You're not
Yeah.
disappointing God if you leave.
Right.
So kind of working through some of those things too.
Yeah. I've been a pastor for a long time, and I know the struggle that people have because people tend to stay in churches because they like the people that are there,
Yeah.
and sometimes they
Right.
like the message or the music or whatever. But at some point, when you're waking up on a Sunday morning or deciding we're going to go on a Sunday afternoon, you're not just thinking about maybe what Pastor Smith is going to tell you. You're thinking about the people you're going to be with, and
Totally.
when someone starts to think maybe I can't be here anymore, the relational loss is really high.
Yeah.
Um, And, you know, some of us in Minneapolis, I'm griping all the time because I don't pastor in a particular church anymore. So I'm looking at different churches to be involved in. And I complain about, I can't really find one that's right in my, so I've kind of picked one, but then maybe I go to another one. Most of the people in the country that struggle with this, they're like,
Yeah.
oh, there's 3 churches within driving distance. You know, there's a Lutheran, there's a
Right.
Presbyterian, and a Catholic one, and then this
Yeah.
evangelical one. I don't know what to do. Like, people really, they don't feel trapped only because they think God's going to be against them. They feel trapped because they're like, I don't know, I want to do something on Wednesday, and these are my friends, and I don't know where else to go. And I've watched a lot of people have to leave churches, and then they're so lonely. You know, I talk to them, we get emails about it, like, hey, in the Vote Common Good world, do you all have a network of churches anywhere? Because I had to leave 4 years ago, and I am so lonely.
Yeah.
I just want some people. Sometimes the patriarchy preserves a whole lot of things that people like. So do you have any, in our final minutes here, do you have any thoughts about that piece of it, the relational difficulty that people have when they're coming to grips with some of these things, and how they're
Yeah.
going to navigate it, and what's tolerable? You know, I thinking, yeah.
Mm.
Anyway,
Yeah, I mean, I do think that leaving is really hard. I don't want to underestimate that at all or downplay that. I still think sometimes it's necessary, but I'm seeing the comment that says, "For a loner like me, it was
yeah.
not a problem."
Irma's
That's
like,
funny.
hey, glad to glad to not do
Good
something on
riddance.
Wednesday with that group.
Yeah.
Thanks,
But
Irma.
we do all like, we need community and connection, even the loners among us, I would dare to say.
Hmm.
And I think it's a matter of, kind of sorting out for ourselves, what does that look like in a meaningful way? What does that look like after leaving a community? How do we build that? Because sometimes we're used to churches kind of doing that for us,
Yeah.
and then we feel very adrift when that stops happening. So I don't take that lightly at all, and I recognize that I speak from a really privileged place here as someone who lives in the Seattle area where there are multiple church options that I
Hmm.
feel reasonably, like, aligned with in terms of values and beliefs. So I do think that that is a privilege. So I hesitate a little bit to speak to experiences that are not that. I know there are online communities, but I do feel that that's not the same as knowing people in person. So I do think it's hard. I think that for me, when I thought about leaving the church that I went to for a long time, I felt a lot of that tied to community. And at the same time, I feel like I found that when I did leave, that I was able to stay friends with the people, many of the people that
Oh.
I was friends
Hmm.
with.
Hmm.
So I think, yeah, I think sometimes maybe we overestimate how much people will just abandon us if we leave.
Yeah.
I think that some people, not everyone, but some people are really open to staying friends with people who have
Yeah.
different views from them. And that's a really good thing as long as we can both be fully who we are and not feel like we have to
Right.
hide the beliefs that we've come to be accepted by someone. I think you can be friends across difference and maintain some of those relationships if you feel like that respect from people. Yeah.
Yeah, right on. So wise. Well, friends, this is Liz Coolidge Jenkins. The book is Nice Churchy Patriarchy: Reclaiming Women's Humanity from Evangelicalism, and a #1 Amazon bestseller in the subcategory of women's spirituality in some window of time. So tells you it's something you may want to pick up yourself or share with someone. Liz, if people finish the book and then want more, or see themselves not really as book readers but idea people, where else can they find your contributions to the world and the stuff you're saying?
Yeah, I blog pretty regularly at lizcooledgejenkins.com and also have kind of a list of different articles that have been out different places. And then I'm also pretty active on Instagram at LizCoolJ. So would love to
Okay.
connect there.
At Liz Cool J. Great name for Instagram. Just
Thank you,
come
thank you.
on. Come on. At Liz Cool J. All right. That's the highlight of the day. Liz, thank you. Thanks for reaching out. We just do a quick hello to other people in the chat. Irma, Jim, thank you. Irma, I think you might be new around here, and if not, nice to see you again. But if you're new, welcome. The Squirrely Prepper, Old Man Jim, just Jim Eaton, Deborah, Holly, all y'all that are in here, Yabbits. So just want to say hi to everybody. Alex, thanks for sticking around with us and being part of the common good life and flow. And if you're not on our email list yet, get on there. In fact, we're going to be announcing that we're heading down to we're going to be offering some opportunities for you to head down to the border, friends, both in Arizona and Texas, in March in Arizona and then April in Texas. So if you're wondering about what's happening at the border and you want to go and have a firsthand experience, we're designing opportunities for you to do that. So keep up with us, and we will be talking about it here, but also in our all of our other channels that are more than just our podcast and live stream. So keep up with us and doing events, voter events, and faith and democracy events around the country. So keep up with us. And Liz, thank you. And find Liz where you can. And if nowhere else, if you're not yet on Instagram, you now have at Liz Cooledge on or Liz Cooledge Jenkins on Instagram. Should be your first follow.
Love that. Thank you.
Yeah, right on. All right, y'all. So I think we're going to be back with astrophysicist Paul Wallace tomorrow. So, check all this stuff out. But we've got some movable issues that we have to work around. So, okay. So maybe see you tomorrow. Maybe see you tomorrow afternoon. Maybe see you Friday. All right.